You want to remember that Israel's principal goal since October 7th, vis-a-vis the Palestinians in Gaza, was to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. Israel's principal goal, although it was not talked about very much in the Western media, was to drive the Palestinians out. They failed. Look at the pictures on the television today. What's happening is the Palestinians are returning to northern Gaza. Exactly the opposite is happening. And what is Netanyahu going to do now, or what is Trump going to do now? They're going to force 2.3 million Palestinians to leave Gaza. You want to remember that these people are not going to leave voluntarily. And there are about 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza. The idea that Israel, with the United States helping, can drive them out into Egypt and Jordan is just not a serious argument.
What happens now? I mean, first, do you think this ceasefire is going to hold? I think it's in three parts, this first sort of 6-week ceasefire. Do you think it's going to hold for that long? Secondly, what happens after that? Is it, well, let me ask you first of all that question. Do you think the ceasefire will hold?
Well, I think the ceasefire will hold until all the hostages are out. There are two phases to the ceasefire. Each one is 6 weeks. And in the first phase, 33 of the 98 hostages come out. And then in the second phase, this is the second 6 weeks, the remaining 65 hostages come out. And I think it is likely that the ceasefire will hold up to that point. But then we morph into the question that you're asking is, what is the long term for Gaza? And that's a very difficult question to answer. I find it hard to believe that the Israelis are going to go back in there and they're going to start all over again where they started in October 2023. That just doesn't make sense to me. But then the question is, what happens inside of Gaza? You want to remember that Hamas is effectively won, which means Hamas is effectively going to be in control of Gaza, which is apparently not acceptable to either Israel or the United States. So the question is, how does this end? And it's very hard to say.
Well, also, you have a leader of the Palestinian Authority who's in his 80s, and there's a lot of concern that if Hamas was not to have any role in leading Gaza after this, and any form of government, then who actually would? Would it be the Palestinian Authority, who, to many people's eyes, are too damaged to do that? And if it's not the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, then who the hell is it?
I don't know. It's certainly not the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority was damaged goods before October 7th, and they're in even worse shape today. It's hard to imagine them coming into Gaza and running the place. The Palestinian Authority is seen as being complicitous with the Israelis. Many Palestinians, maybe most Palestinians, think that the Palestinian Authority does Israel's dirty work in the West Bank. And the last thing they need is for the PA to come into Gaza and do Israel's dirty work there. So it's not going to be the PA. It is possible that some sort of new organization or institution will be created, but it's hard to see what that is at this point in time. And furthermore, even if you replace Hamas, whoever comes in to replace Hamas is going to have deeply hostile relations with Israel, because Israel is interested not only in cleansing Gaza, but Israel is deeply interested in not giving the Palestinians a state of their own. And the end result of that is the Palestinians are going to continue to resist. You know, we had a first intifada and we had a second intifada before we had October 7th. So if you don't have some sort of meaningful peace agreement where the Palestinians get some sense of sovereignty over a fixed piece of land, there's no chance that this is going to go away. You're going to have apartheid for as far as the eye can see. And apartheid, from my point of view, is a prescription for disaster for Israel, for the Palestinians, and for the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to be a very concerning situation, because I've always felt from the start, I felt several things. One, I felt that Israel had a fundamental duty to its people to respond with force after October the 7th. They had to. particularly given that Hamas went on record, on camera, within a week saying we're going to keep doing this as many times as we can get away with it. So if you're Israel, you had to do something big. The problem was what was proportionate and what would not end up, if they weren't careful about their response, being a situation that would inflame rather than douse down the threat. And it's very hard to see right now, despite all the protestations from Benjamin Netanyahu, that he's won and everything else. When you see the scenes going on with these hostages being released with so many Hamas terrorists around, so many people supporting them, and you get the intelligence reports from the Americans saying that they believe they've all been replaced anyway by people with the same ideology, the very fear that I've had, which is that you can kill a group of terrorists as you identify them, but if you don't kill the ideology, and in fact you fuel it, you could end up with a worse scenario going forward than you had before.
I agree completely. I mean, the fact is that there is no purely military solution to this problem. The Israelis have this belief that they can use the big stick. They can use military force, what they sometimes call the iron wall, to beat the Palestinians into submission. They've been trying this formula for decades. It does not work. The only way you're going to resolve this conflict is to come up with a political solution. And this is the principal reason that so many American presidents have pushed hard for a two-state solution. A two-state solution is a political solution, and it gives the Palestinians a sovereign state of their own. And most people recognize, at least outside of Israel, that that is the only way you're ever going to shut this conflict down.
But the problem with the two-state solution is that Netanyahu has shown zero interest, it seems to me, for more than 20 years in having a two-state solution. In fact, if you look at the history since the start of the new century, Netanyahu was very, very keen for billions of dollars to be funneled to Hamas from 2005 onwards, and didn't seem to have any idea what they were then spending that money on. And then we find out on October the 7th, actually, they spent it on a very sophisticated tunnel system, which allowed them to then run and hide amongst civilians, making the response from Israel almost impossible in the way that they were conducting it without massive civilian loss. So it seemed to me that at every stage of this, Netanyahu's desire for a two-state solution has been almost non-existent, and yet he's still prime minister. So if the person in charge of Israel at the moment has no interest in a two-state solution, then although most people outside think it's the only way this ever eventually gets resolved, how does it get resolved?
Well, it's important to emphasize, Piers, that Netanyahu is hardly the only Israeli leader who's opposed to a two-state solution. There's a rich history of opposition to two states in the Israeli national security establishment. So Netanyahu's not an anomaly here. You also want to ask yourself the question, given what's happened since October 7th in Gaza and even what's going on in the West Bank, can you really imagine a workable two-state solution? I thought a two-state solution was dead before October 7th, but it's deader than dead at this point in time, just given the events since October 7th. So I don't see that as a viable alternative. You then raised the question, what is the solution here? And I don't see any solution. I think what you're going to get is pretty much a continuation of the situation that existed before October 7th, which is where Greater Israel is effectively an apartheid state, and where the Palestinians who live in the West Bank and in Gaza are constantly looking for opportunities to rise up against the Israelis and create a first intifada, second intifada, or another October 7th. This is a disastrous situation for Israel. And of course, it's a disastrous situation for the Palestinians as well.
Donald Trump, obviously very pro-Israeli, but he's also got very good relationships with people like the Crown Prince here in Saudi Arabia. He's made it clear he wants to go and see him sooner rather than later, as he did last time when he won office. And there's obviously, I think, a desire for more normalization with Israel if this situation gets resolved. And they want it resolved in the Middle East on the Arab side with a two-state solution. Can you see any more normalization of relations between countries like Saudi, for example, with Israel, if it isn't resolved?
I think there is a chance, maybe even a good chance, that you can have somewhere in the future, not too distant future, another Abraham Accord. You remember Trump was the person who put together the Abraham Accords when he was president the first time around. And he really wants an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia. It is possible that the Saudis, who have no special place in their heart for the Palestinians, would be willing to agree to an Abraham Accord. But the question you have to ask yourself is, what are the consequences of that? It has zero effect on the Palestinian problem, both in Gaza and in the West Bank. It has zero effect on the problem with Hezbollah. It has zero effect on what's going on in Syria. And it has zero effect on what's going on with regard to Iran. So an Abraham Accord may improve relations between the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia in particular and Israel. But in terms of dealing with the really thorny issues that are out there, it matters for little.
Does Netanyahu survive? There's a lot of heat now coming from a lot of Israelis saying he thinks he's got this completely wrong. They shouldn't have done this deal with Hamas, that Hamas's show of strength is a reminder to people they haven't been beaten, far from it. Could the pressure on Netanyahu get to the extent that he has to resign?
You know, he's a politician who has at least 9 lives, so he's not the sort of person that you want to say is heading for the exit. But let me just say that, first of all, he is ultimately responsible for what happened on October 7th. And number two, it's becoming manifestly clear to the Israeli public and other Israeli elites that Israel failed in Gaza. And you see all sorts of pieces, including pieces written by Israeli generals in the Israeli media making that point. So, you know, it's now clear what the outcome is in Gaza, and it is not good for him. The other thing is that his health is not good. He just had his prostate removed, and there's been talk that he's having heart problems as well. So I think given his health and given the state of Israel today, I wouldn't be surprised if he's pushed overboard in the next couple months.